Okay, beautiful. Okay, let's get that live streaming going again, and then we'll be good to go. Thanks everybody for your patience. I'm sorry for the 4-minute, 5-minute delay. Okay, we are almost there. Oh, I'm glad everyone made it back in. Hey, everybody. Good, fantastic. All right, now we're actually ready to start. So hey there, folks. I am so happy to be back with you for this, third or fourth year, I think fourth year of language documentation webinars. Good morning from Egypt. Hi there. Great. I am so happy to see folks from all over the world here tonight. Alia, we can't see each other because this is a webinar format. We have about 400 people registered. And so if we all had our videos on, it might get a little chaotic. So we're gonna be just seeing the leader of the workshop every week, but y'all are more than welcome to chat with each other in the meantime. So, all right, I am gonna get the screen share started. Can everybody see the slides? Great, perfect, all right. And hello to Puerto Rico and the Philippines and Alaska and Pakistan, hi. Great, so let's go ahead and get started. This is the very first session in our 9-week language documentation webinar. And I'm so happy you're here, truly. It is one of my favorite things that ELP does, this webinar, and I enjoy it every single year. Every Friday night, or depending on your time zone, it will be Saturday morning. For the next 9 weeks, we're going to have a different person leading a workshop on a specific topic in language documentation. And this week, week 1, I'm going to be talking a little bit about what language documentation is and what it's for. And before we start, I'd really like to acknowledge the traditional keepers of this territory, the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and the many other nations and peoples who have lived and traveled and cared for the lands here at the Columbia and Willamette River valleys since time immemorial. In the place now called Portland, Oregon, and Chinook Wawa is still spoken here. So a little bit of housekeeping stuff before we start. First of all, questions and discussions are very much encouraged. Don't be shy. I don't want to just talk to myself here. So please drop any thoughts or questions or comments or any of your own experiences in the chat. If you have actual questions that you would like me to answer, it's best if you use the question feature, but I'll try and check the chat as well. If you are watching on Facebook, I will try to monitor the Facebook comments too. Forgive me if there's a small delay as I try and catch up with all the comments. And again, there is a little bit of lag if you're watching on Facebook, so there might be 30 to 90 seconds between you typing something and me seeing it. So just be patient, I'm not ignoring you. Many of you asked if there will be certificates for completing this webinar. In the past, we haven't been able to do that because we really had no way of recording who attended each session. The good news is this year, since we are on Zoom, we actually are able to track attendance. And so everybody who attends at least 8 of the 9 sessions live will receive a certificate for attending. If you are not able to make it to the live sessions because of your time zone or your schedule or something else, please write to me and we'll figure out some other way. Oh, Maria, yes, I see the question. Could you share with us the Facebook group and YouTube page? Yeah, let me just drop that in the chat real quick. So the Facebook group is this. And the YouTube URL, I don't know off the top of my head, so I'll put that in at the end. But we will be posting all of these videos and slides on both the YouTube and the Facebook after each session. And oh, hello from Sierra Leone. Great. And so some of you have also asked if you can present your own documentation work to the group at the end of this webinar. So if you learn some really interesting skills during this webinar, you decide to conduct your own documentation work, fantastic. We would love to hear about what you're doing. We will have a showcase for everyone to share their work on December 2nd. So as we go through, if you find that you would really like to talk about what you're doing, let me know. And oops. There may also be some curiosity about what language documentation actually looks like in real life, right? How does it work? What are some of the products you might come up with? Well, glad you asked. We hope you can join us tomorrow for the Language Documentation Training Fellows Showcase. Oh, hi, Anando, great to see you. So there are 3 folks from Nigeria, Fiji, and the Solomon Islands who have been learning with us over the summer about language documentation and conducting some of their own documentation projects. Tomorrow, they will be presenting some of the audio-visual material they have collected and talking a little bit about their experiences as beginner language documenters. So that should be really useful and interesting to a lot of y'all. I hope you can join us. I will put the registration link in the chat right now. There you go. So hope you can join us at 2 p.m. Pacific, which, depending on where you are, will be evening time in Europe and Africa, and maybe very early morning in Asia and Pacific. And all right, now that that administrative stuff is out of the way, let me introduce myself properly. So hello, I'm Anna Ballou. I'm the program manager for the Endangered Languages Project. And I am also an adjunct assistant professor of linguistics at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Also, I know I have a fairly strong American accent, so if I am talking too fast or I'm not speaking clearly, please just let me know in the chat and I will slow down. So a little bit about my own background in language documentation, just so you know sort of where I'm coming from and what my own training has been. I did my bachelor's and master's degrees at Boston University, working with Kathy O'Connor, who was trained in the 1960s in language documentation, working with Northern Pomo in California. And I completed my PhD at the University of Hawaii, working with Lyle Campbell, who's a documentary linguist, Katie Drager, who's a sociolinguist, Andrea Perez-Croker and Tucker Childs, who are also both documentary linguists, generally speaking. So I guess you could say my training is in the University of Hawaii School of Language Documentation. But most of my own documentation work has been in Cameroon in Central Africa, working with 2 languages called Iasa when I was a PhD student and Majumba when I was a master's student. So most of my own experience is from Cameroon, but I'm very happy to learn about language documentation work anywhere in the world. So let's actually get started. Most of y'all get this right on the first try. You're all very well-informed people. But how many languages do you think exist in the world today? Let's have some guesses in chat. And if you've been in this webinar before, no cheating, let other people guess. 6,000, that's a pretty good guess. Ah, look at that, I'm seeing just a flood of 7,000s. You guys really know it, huh? That's really interesting. When we started these in 2019, very few people actually guessed 7,000-ish languages. I think that education has gone out to the public in the last few years, which is really cool. Or you're all experts. Either way, that's great. Yes, about 7,000 languages. It's really hard to count languages in a meaningful way, but that's our best guess. And most of those languages have pretty small populations of people who use them, right? So roughly 96% of the entire global population use the 4% of largest languages, whereas 96% of the languages in the world are spoken by about 4% of the total global population. So that means that the vast majority of languages in the whole world have pretty small speaker or signer populations. And that actually can increase the odds of language endangerment for those small languages. Not necessarily, but it can factor in. So when we say endangered, what do we actually mean when we're talking about languages, right? I think a lot of us are used to hearing endangered to refer to animals or plants or other biological species. But endangered is also a term commonly used for languages. I will say at this point that there are actually a lot of issues with using the term endangered and these other biological metaphors around languages. And a lot of Indigenous communities in particular really don't like this term as applied to languages for lots of very good reasons. I'm using it here in a very general sense because I think it's a term that's familiar to a lot of people in a lot of parts of the world. But if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the ways people talk about language loss and some of the different perspectives around terms and words used, I would encourage you to check out the first video from the advanced documentation webinar last year. There's a link in the slides, which I will post afterwards. But in general terms, endangered, referring to a language, means that it's at risk of not being spoken anymore, right? Maybe that will happen quite soon, or maybe it will happen in a few generations, or maybe it won't happen at all. Maybe the language will continue to thrive for a long time. Endangered just refers to that state of risk. And that risk is very real. There are many hundreds of languages that have stopped being used in just the last 60 years alone. And those past 60 or so years is actually the time of most rapid language loss that we know of in all of human history. This is not a natural process. This is not normal. This is not the way things have always happened. This is a very unusual period of history as far as language loss. And we're actually looking at nearly half of all languages that are currently endangered. And that's only by one way of measuring endangerment. So the Catalog of Endangered Languages is the research project that provides the information that we use on the ELP website. And it's based at the University of Hawaii. And by their calculations, the figure is about 46% of all languages in the entire world that are currently endangered. If you use a broader definition of endangerment than the catalog does, it could be much more than that, right? So we might say it's at least half of all languages that are currently some level of endangered. The real question is why, right? For a lot of sociolinguists, language documenters, and especially for the communities who use these languages, the question of why is very salient. Yeah, Miguel, I see your hand up. Feel free to ask questions. Generally, I'll answer them at the end, but if you have questions as I'm talking, just raise your hand. Yeah, Miguel, if you do have a question, feel free to put it in the questions or the chat, and I will answer it. But one thing that is important to note when we're talking about language endangerment is that back in 1948, the linguist Morris Swadesh said something very important. The factors determining obsolescence of languages are non-linguistic. And what this means in sort of ordinary language is languages don't become endangered because of anything that has to do with the language itself, right? So sometimes you might hear, oh, that language is too complicated, that's why no one's learning it. Or conversely, it's too simple, you can't really express anything, that's why no one's learning it. Not true. Languages don't become endangered because they're too hard to learn, right? Any human child can pretty much learn any language. Similarly, some people might say, oh, this language is more logical, that's why it's dominant, or this language is more beautiful, that's why it's dominant. And again, it's simply not true from a scientific perspective, from a linguistic perspective. And perhaps most importantly, there's no such thing as a language that is not fit for the modern world. This is racist garbage. No language is primitive from a linguistic standpoint. All languages are equally fit for use in the modern world and in all contexts. Even if they need to develop new vocabulary, English didn't have a word for email or cell phone 50 years ago. We made one up. Any language can develop new vocabulary and adapt to new situations. So at the end of the day, there is nothing about a language itself that causes it to become endangered. So what then actually does cause language endangerment? I see in the chat, Tara notes, colonialism and the Indian residential school system is why our language is endangered here in BC. Yes, that is a huge factor, especially here in North America. And that is the first thing that I want to talk about. What actually causes languages to become endangered is things that affect the people who use those languages. Language endangerment is always a social issue, a human issue. Sun, yes, the video of the meeting will be available after this. So what are these kinds of systemic issues that affect people and produce language endangerment? Well, the first category could be called physical factors. It could be called the really, really bad stuff. Essentially, this includes the really huge, terrible things that happen to large groups of people, including genocide, war, natural disaster, large-scale disease, settlement colonialism especially, linguicide and other kinds of forced assimilation, the terrible things that people either do to each other or that happen in the world, like natural disasters. So these are often core root causes of language endangerment. Not always. There are cases where none of this comes into play, but often. Economic factors are also tied into a whole lot of cases of language endangerment, right? And these also clearly are related to the previous slide. Things like any kind of colonization can have a big effect on economic circumstances. But let's say, for example, people start needing to move to cities to earn enough money to survive because their traditional livelihoods are no longer available. Moving to a city where people don't speak your language obviously can really contribute to language shift. Loss of people's traditional lands and territories that force them to migrate, or again, war or conflict that forces them to migrate. All of this stuff is very often a factor in language endangerment. Similarly, the large-scale political and legal factors often have something to do with language endangerment. So whether there is an overt policy against a language within a specific nation, whether it's actually illegal to use a language or you're simply not allowed to use it in schools or religious services or wherever else. There's also sort of less obvious, more subtle kinds of political repression where there simply is no infrastructure or no resources given to sustaining a language in the contexts it needs. So for example, there's a really tragic case a couple of years ago where Udmurt scholar Albert Razin actually killed himself in front of the state council building in Udmurtia, Russia, protesting a language policy that canceled education in his language. And he was very concerned about the effects this would have on the language. Similarly, you may see in North America English-only movements, which aim to sort of suppress the use of all languages other than English. This also happens in other countries with their national languages. So these things often factor in, not always, but often. And then there's sort of what you might call social and attitudinal factors, right? How people feel and think about language definitely affects what they do with language. And so some of these things might broadly be called prestige, right? The languages people think are cool and cosmopolitan and wealth generating. People sometimes may be ashamed of their language, usually as a result of historical events. But in almost every case, it's some mixture of these things, because really at the core, all of these things tend to tie together in really complex ways, right? Resettlement leads to economic changes, leads to shame, leads to migration, leads to loss of language in some cases, and so on. All of it interacts with each other in very complex ways. So usually it's some combination of this stuff. And if you have any insights about which of these factors may be affecting your language community today or historically, drop them in the chat. I would love to learn more about your language context. And I think in all of this, it's very important to remember not to blame people or communities for shifting away from a language. Sometimes you'll hear, well, if people choose to use another language, what's the big deal, right? It's their free choice. We shouldn't stop them from shifting to the national language and abandoning their language. There are very few cases where the choice to abandon a language is non-coerced, where we can really and truly call that a free choice. I'm sure they exist. I've heard of a couple that could theoretically be considered free choice, but in most cases, sorry, let's go back. In most cases, there aren't very good options when people are choosing to shift to another language. If you are having to pick between surviving or feeding your kids or not being arrested or having the prospect for material advancement versus not shifting to another language, that's not really a free choice. It's not an uncoerced choice. This is a very complicated topic, though, and people have a lot of different perspectives on it. So I really welcome y'all to talk respectfully about it with each other in the group. I see that in the chat, yeah, most other factors can be traced to colonization itself. Yes, it is a many-tentacled beast. Ezra notes, war and drought affected languages in my country. Yeah, that's tough. Natural disaster and conflict causes a lot of ripple effects, including language shift. And Tara notes, many families in our community lost our language over one generation because of residential schools. Yeah. And this is a good time to note that today is Orange Shirt Day or Truth and Reconciliation Day in Canada, where the survivors and those who did not make it out of residential schools are honored and remembered. So I encourage all of you to learn a little bit about the history and ongoing nature of residential schools in North America and elsewhere. And think a little bit about the resilience of peoples who have kept their languages despite that. So when we say a language is endangered, is it a yes/no thing? Is it like endangered, not endangered? Well, not really. It's kind of, it's more like a scale. It's not even really a scale. It's kind of a field of existence where you can be in different places, but scholars sort of try to quantify it into a simple scale. So at the least severe end, the green end of the scale, we have languages that are at some level of risk, right? They're doing pretty well today, but it's possible that in the future, they might lose speakers, they might lose young people. So a language like Sasak in Indonesia has about 2 million speakers, including some kids, but it's possible that in the future, it might not be as strong. Then we have languages in the middle in the what we call the threatened area, like Iasa, the language I worked with in Cameroon, where there are about 2,000 speakers. Mostly kids don't speak it, but some do. And so this is a language that is indeed facing pretty serious threats if nothing is done. At the far end of the scale, we have languages that are critically endangered. And this is a term we use to mean there are probably just a few speakers alive today. Young people may not know it at all. It may not be used in a lot of parts of life, like you may not be able to go to the store in that language or go to school. And then at the extreme end of the scale, we have languages that have already become dormant. And dormant is just sort of another word for sleeping. We use this word at ELP and in a lot of language documentation and revitalization spaces as an alternative to extinct or dead or other awful words like this, why do we say dormant or sleeping? Well, when something is dead, when we're talking about an animal or a plant or a person, you can't physically revive a dead thing yet. We haven't yet learned how to bring a dead sheep back to life, right? Death is permanent. But with a language, that's not the case, which is a wonderful thing. Even if there is no one living today who knows the language, if we have good records of that language, people can still learn it and bring it back and wake it up. So sleeping or dormant allows for the possibility for a language to wake up, to be awakened. And so we use that term to represent the truth that it's not too late to bring a language back if we have good records. And so that is why we make records. Hopefully all of us here already agree that language loss, language endangerment, and all languages in the world really matter. Especially in this context, we're largely talking about Indigenous, endangered, underdocumented, and minoritized languages. They matter for all kinds of reasons, too many reasons for me to cover in a short webinar. But for things like cultural and spiritual and social identity, language is a really central factor for a lot of people. For health and well-being, both physical health, right? Indigenous language retention is linked to lower rates of smoking, lower rates of alcohol and drug abuse, lower suicide rates, better overall physical health, as well as better mental health, better overall well-being in both individuals and communities. I'm happy to share some resources on the research that has proven that. Also, arts and humanities, right? When a language is lost, generations, maybe millennia of poetry and song and storytelling and all kinds of art goes with it. Political rights as well. The UN, among other political bodies, have acknowledged that using and passing on your own language is, in fact, a human right that can't be taken away. Of course, scientific knowledge, right? Languages encode all kinds of medical, ecological, historical, biological, other kinds of knowledge, right? Math systems, astronomy, all sorts of stuff is embedded in language. And similarly, languages also tell linguists and cognitive scientists a whole lot about how human minds work. If we were only able as linguists to study like English and Russian and Tagalog, we would have a very poor understanding of the human mind and human language, right? And so we need to really understand how language works in every language if we want to really get linguistics. And there's a lot more that language matters for. So I'd love to hear from y'all. Why does your language matter most to you? And why does language matter to the people around you, right? Your family members, people in your community, people in your country. What do people talk about when they talk about why languages matter to them? And something good to think about as we move forward. What parts of your language do you feel are most important to safeguard for the future, to make records of? And right, we're not the only ones who think languages matter. The UN is with us. So 2019 was the International Year of Indigenous Languages. And following a lot of really great activism by Indigenous language advocates, that year was extended to a full decade of Indigenous languages. So this is the very first year of the UN Decade of Indigenous Languages. Hopefully, it will be a great 10 years of language activism, documentation, and revitalization. So let's not pretend otherwise. This is a very difficult time for language diversity. This is probably the worst time for language diversity in known human history. But it's also the best time for language revitalization, reclamation, and documentation. People all over the world are doing incredible work to keep their languages safe for future generations and record the knowledge and practices of their communities. And a recent study by Gabriela Perez Baez at the University of Oregon actually tracked the birth of language revitalization programs around the world over time. And since the year 2000, there has been this enormous increase in language revitalization happening all over the globe, and even more really since the year 2010. So we're seeing this steep upwards slope in language revitalization activities, which is really encouraging. And I'm hoping that during the decade, we'll see an even bigger increase as more and more people realize they can do this. You can do this. So one of the things that we can do when faced with this situation of global language endangerment is documentation. And in the canonical definition of language documentation, sort of the paper that linguists look to when they define it, is documentation is the process of creating a lasting, multi-purpose record of a language. So we'll unpack that definition a little bit. But before we do, I want to note, I'm going to be talking about language documentation from mostly a Western academic perspective. I am a settler here in the US. I'm trained in the university. That's who I am and how I learned. But language documentation is not only what I'm going to tell you today. There are a lot of ways to think about it and a lot of ways to do it. And all of them are very valid and useful. So really, I hope you won't just follow precisely what I say today. You'll think about what's most important for your community, your language, and what you think is right there. There's no single correct path. It's up to you to figure out the best ways that fit most for your context. So when we are talking about creating a lasting multi-purpose record, what we're really talking about is making recordings, right, of all the ways language is used, all the different aspects of language. So this includes not only documenting just one language, it can include documenting all of the languages used in a given community. I'm sure many of you are from very multilingual places. In the best case scenario, it involves using professional, high quality recording equipment, right? So like a nice microphone, an audio recorder, a video camera, if possible, because the goal is to have really good recordings that are clear and easy to understand for the future. Language documentation can also involve keeping language data in an archive, which is a specialized place to keep recordings safe for the very long term. So not just sort of putting it in your desk drawer where a mouse could eat it. An archive is a place where people are trained to keep recordings safe for hundreds of years. And documentation can also involve studying the language, right? Learning about the ways it works, how the sentences are built, how the sounds work, and how that language is used in everyday life. So what's a good starting point, right? What are the kinds of things people record when they're doing this work? The basic building blocks of language definitely include words and sentences, right? All of us, when we talk, we use words and sentences. And if you're learning a language, that's probably where you're going to start, right? You'll want to learn how to say like cell phone and pen and water bottle. You'll also want to learn how to build sentences with those words. But beyond that, it's also pretty important to record the ways people really talk in everyday life. So conversations between, people around you, speeches that somebody might give at a wedding or a funeral, other important speech acts, what we call speech acts, right? These can be special kinds of talking, like a ceremonial discourse or what a judge says in court, any of that, great for language documentation. But it's also not just about formal settings and important words. Really, anything that people do in their everyday life is important to record, right? So stories, songs, proverbs, riddles, recipes, instructions for how to make a fishing net, your auntie's favorite joke. Everyday language use is what we're trying to record, because in the future, if people want to learn about the language, if they want to get it back, if they want to reclaim it, they'll need to know how people really talked in their everyday life so that they will be able to use the language in their everyday life. So really anything and everything that people do with language is a good thing to document. Generally, sort of the core parts of a documentation from an academic perspective include recording the sounds that a language uses, or if we're talking about a sign language, the hand shapes. So this is called phonology, and we'll be learning about that in week 3. We also generally want to make a record of the words, right? The lexicon. This is what we might turn into a dictionary. We also study the way words are formed and how they get turned into sentences. So this is what we might, or sorry, how words get turned into other words, right? So like how the word drive turns into driving in English. This is called morphology. We also look at how words are put together to make sentences. We call this syntax, and we'll be learning about morphology and syntax in week 4. We also kind of want to record and study the way sentences are put together to turn into conversations or speeches or riddles. And we also generally collect examples of the language really being used in everyday life by regular people, or stories or songs. And we call these texts, even though they're not often written, they're spoken, but we call them texts because of historical reasons. And then once we've sort of covered that basic, it can take a decade to cover all that stuff. But there are also more specialized topics that you can choose to document. And these are infinite possibilities of topics you could specialize in. So some real examples of documentation projects from my colleagues include in-law languages. Does anyone here know about in-law languages, or do they use this in your community? In some cultures, you really can't or shouldn't pronounce the name of your father-in-law or mother-in-law or brother-in-law. Usually it's people of the opposite gender of the person in the family of the person you're married to. If you have that in your language or your community, let us know. There are also things like special vocabulary used for hunting or farming. Sometimes there are really rich sets of vocabulary for that kind of thing. There are things like differences in pronunciation between people, right? Maybe a vowel sounds a little bit different in this village versus this village. That's called sociolinguistic variation. We could also look at how kids learn to talk, even very special parts of how kids learn to talk, like do they make mistakes forming plurals when they're little? Oh, Anando says we have in-law languages in our community. That's really cool. Yeah, I'd love to hear more about that. You could also focus on multilingualism. Oh, Ezra says my mom's grandma never says her husband's name. Yeah, that could be an avoidance language, right? There are a lot of ways people use to get around those names. So I'm curious, when your mom's grandma has to talk about her husband, what does she say? Drop that in the chat if you'd like to. You could also look at patterns of multilingualism. You could look at how songs are formed in tone languages. You could look at special varieties of language used just by women or men or initiated groups or whatever. I could go on forever. There are so many interesting things that people do with language that are great topics for documentation. So, language documentation covers a lot of stuff. It's a very wide field, right? And in a perfect world, in sort of the ideals of language documentation, we'd record everything, but we're just humans and we have limited time and resources and recording space on our recorders. So we kind of have to make choices about what we focus on. And a really common question in these webinars is, how should I document my language? Where do I start? What should I do? And I can't answer that for you, but we can talk about your goals and think through how documentation can best meet your needs and your community's needs. So, oh, let's see. I notice in the chat, Ezra says, so when your mom's grandma has to talk about her husband, she says something like father of Anne or a nickname. Yeah, that's really cool. I think that's a pretty common strategy to avoid saying the name of somebody you're not supposed to say. That's awesome. All right, so when we're thinking about our goals and priorities and documentation, a good place to start is, who are we creating this documentation for? Ideally, it's for everybody in the entire world, past, present, and future, but that's not realistic. We have to focus a little bit. So are we really making this for language learners, either now or in the future? Who don't speak the language, right? Are we creating materials for people who want to learn the language? Are we making this for people who already do speak the language, right? Community members now who might be listening in 5 or 10 years, or maybe their children or grandchildren? Are we making this for researchers like linguists or anthropologists or sociologists? Are we making this for biologists or other kinds of scientists or knowledge keepers in your community? Or somebody else, right? So think about when you imagine someone accessing your recordings, who do you want it to be and what do you want them to get from it? And you might also think about what outcomes are the highest priority, right? Are you hoping to develop a learner's guide or a grammar for your language for people to learn to speak or sign it? Are you hoping to create extra materials for language learners to study or practice with? Are you looking to make recordings to give to family members of the speakers or their descendants in the future? Right, so it can be really powerful to have access to recordings of your great-great-grandfather or your husband's great aunt, right? To be actually able to hear those people speaking in the past can be really important. Do you want to make a dictionary? Do you want to make a talking dictionary or a language app? Do you want to make a book of recipes or a book of stories or oral histories, right? The options are pretty much limitless, and you should also think about whether you want to put these things in an archive for the long term. Similarly, do you want to make cool YouTube or TikTok videos to get young people interested today? These are all great options. So when we talk about all this, it could sound like language documentation is just about recording a bunch of stuff and then dropping them on a hard drive and leaving it there. Well, it could be, but not ideally. So when we're talking about language documentation as a field, as sort of its own discipline, its own thing, we're not just talking about making recordings. We're talking about making those recordings and then doing something with them. We might call it annotation. We might call it, product creation. Documentation is when you get the recordings and then you add information to them to make them helpful to the people who read them or listen to them. If someone just hears a speech in a language they don't understand, there's sort of a limit to what they can get from that. But if you have that recording of that speech and you have a translation into a more widely spoken language, and in the best case, you actually have information about each word that's being used and all of its nuances and all of the little grammatical pieces in it, that can be a really powerful learning tool. So ideally, you get the recordings and then you annotate them. So some of these annotation products include things like lexical databases, right? A database of all of the words and word pieces in your language. And we'll talk about some of these specific tools and softwares going forward on, I think, week 6 or 7. We also might end up with transcribed and annotated sentences or longer texts. So like I was saying, if we have a story or a speech with definitions of each word and each little particle, we have softwares like Elan or Flex or First Voices to do this. We'll talk about those as well. You could also, if you're a linguist-y type, you could do analysis of some of the systems in your language, like the sounds or the sentence structure. And then finally, kind of at the most complicated end, we could end up with language corpora. These are really big collections of structured language data that tend to be used for computational purposes, right? If you want to make a spell check or a text generator or a Siri or whatever in your language, you'll need a corpus. But again, these aren't the only options. You can get really creative. Anything that you want to document, anything that you want to produce with that documentation is probably awesome. And I think something to keep in mind is that language documentation isn't just about what you produce. It's also about the act of documenting itself. And in my own experience as a language documenter, the action of documenting can be just as or more important, right? Because when you're talking to people about their language, when you're recording how they use language, that's a very strong relational activity. You're doing something very, very personal, right? Language is very close to our hearts in a lot of ways. And when you work with other people to record language, there's a lot of relationship building that happens and needs to happen. And so just recording or documenting parts of a language can do things like really honor and elevate and respect the knowledge and expertise of language keepers and speakers, right? Making them understand that you acknowledge and respect all of the things that they know and can do with language. Similarly, it can increase the prestige and visibility and awareness of the language in your community when they see that there is a person or people who are spending all this time and effort to make records of the language. People tend to stop and think, well, okay, maybe there's something really important here if this person is spending all their time on it. And again, building relationships within the community, maybe between you and the people you work with, or other people working on the documentation project, can really build strong bonds between people. And if you're working with your own language, doing documentation can teach you a lot about your own community, your own language, your own identity. It can be a really powerful personal process. And a lot more. I'd love to hear what language documentation has meant to you other than just making recordings of words. But I want to encourage everybody to give a lot of careful attention to how you do language documentation work, the actual day-to-day reality of doing these recordings, and not just think about, oh, I'm going to have such a big dictionary, right? Think about the relationships you're building and how you're going about this. That's really important too. And on that note, I want to say, I think most of you probably already understand this, but I just want to emphasize that we never document things that are not okay to share or record. So when I say that anything and everything is a good target for language documentation, that does not include things that are not okay to record. Things that are sacred or secret or private or not for public consumption or not okay to share outside the community, never ever go beyond people's preferences and record that stuff. If you're not really sure what's okay or not okay to record, always ask. Always, always, always ask. Hopefully you have good relationships within the community and people you trust to help you navigate this stuff. Always, always respect the preferences and boundaries and protocols of the people you're working with. And there's some great readings about this in the slides. And so as we wind up, you might be thinking, well, okay, we talked about documentation. What about language revitalization? And that's a little bit beyond the scope of this session because it's a different activity. It's a different practice, but they're not totally unrelated. Language revitalization often relies on good documentation, and documentation can be a step towards language revitalization, right? These records we're making can be thought of as sort of a safety net for the future, right? If, God forbid, there comes a day when no one still living knows the language, people can turn to these records and bring back the language, wake up the language. And this isn't just hypothetical, right? There are communities in the world who have awakened languages that had no speakers through good documentation. And so sort of the difference between these two is that documentation is about creating records of a language, recordings of a language, and revitalization is about creating users and use of a language, right? Bringing it back into everyday use, everyday life. So they're two separate things, but they also really tie together. We're going to be focusing on documentation for the most part in this webinar. And you may be asking yourself, okay, is my language endangered enough to bother documenting it? Well, the good news is documentation is not just for endangered languages. Even if your language is pretty strong, people speak it every day, kids know it, you use it at school and work and in the market, it may still need documentation. There may not be very good records of your language. So if your language is not English, Mandarin, Arabic, French, German, Spanish, Russian, Japanese, or Korean, right? Kind of the most studied and most documented languages, there's a pretty good chance your language needs more documentation. If there's not a ton of media in your language, if there's not a Facebook interface, if you can't use your cell phone in your language, there's always more to do to bring your language into more parts of life. So don't worry if your language is not endangered. There's still work to do. We still want you here in this webinar. So I want to conclude by saying I'm glad you're here because learning to do language documentation is a big service to your community and your language. It's a really great thing to learn how to do. And I hope that you'll enjoy it, that you'll find it meaningful, and that you'll gain some skills and ideas here that will help you in whatever you hope to do with your language. So over the next 9 weeks, we're going to build up some of the basic ideas and skills that could be useful to you doing this. So let's have some questions. I'm going to open up the question panel and we'll get going. So first off, I see a question from Krishna, or really a statement. He says, language has two facets, language as a tool and language as an identity. If a community does not balance the two aspects, its language is certain to be endangered. That's an interesting perspective. Yeah, language can be both a tool and an identity marker. Maybe even both, right? Maybe those two things overlap a little bit. What do you guys think? Krishna also says that my studies show that socioeconomic factors are more responsible for language endangerment than any other. Yeah, that is true in a lot of communities, that the core of language shift pressures are economic. Economies are social and historical things, right? They're not natural forces like the Northern Lights. Economies are shaped by history and power and politics and all this other stuff. So really, yeah, it all ties together, right? We have a question that says, how long are the webinars each week? Usually they're about an hour. If there are a bunch of questions, we might go a little bit longer. So I'm happy to stay and answer questions as long as you have them. How is discourse analysis different from text, asks Spandan. So discourse analysis is a technical term for a field of linguistics, but texts are sort of what you might analyze when you're doing discourse analysis. So discourse analysis is like an analytic framework, a framework for answering research questions. And texts are the materials that you're studying. So you might do a discourse analysis of a conversation between two people at a bar. That conversation is the text itself. And then the analytical framework, the research framework that you use to look at that conversation could be the one we call discourse analysis. And if you are interested in learning more about discourse analysis, I'm happy to drop some resources. Let's see, Joshua asks, will these slides be made available? Yes, absolutely. I will post them in the Facebook group. That's the only place I really have to share files at the moment. So if you don't have a Facebook account and are not able to join the Facebook group, just send me an email and I'll make like a Google Drive folder where you can download them. All right, that is it for the formal questions. If you have more questions, drop them in the question and answer box. So I'm going to check the chat now. Let's see. So Ezra notes that language matters because we have identity issues due to cultural and ethnic diversity. Yeah, language and let's see, the relationships between groups of people tie together really closely, right? And sometimes people will blame language diversity for like tension or conflict between groups, but really it's not the fault of language diversity. It's just sort of a symbol of existing tensions or conflicts, right? There are lots of multilingual places where there's not very much conflict, and there are monolingual places where there's lots of conflict. So it's not a causation factor. Language can just sort of represent conflicts between people. Let's see. So Yishan says, sometimes I guess the language communities would be more interested in documenting more culture-related topics than more linguistic-related topics. Yeah, for sure. I think most non-linguists would rather learn about oral histories or cooking practices or any other cool cultural stuff than looking at, say, verbal morphology. That's not the most exciting thing to a lot of non-linguists. But I will say it is pretty important if you're hoping to make documents for future learners, for language reclamation, etc. It is really good to have that linguistic-y stuff recorded and annotated. It doesn't mean you have to do it, but if you want to find a linguist who finds that stuff interesting to do it, that's probably a good idea. Let's see. We have some more discussion of in-law language. So Tarab and Anando both shared about their in-law languages. So Tarab says, my grandma would use our man instead of her husband's name. Oh, cool. Yeah, that's cute. My grandma also used to call my grandfather something like daddy or papa. Maybe that's pretty common. Anando says, my grandmother could never pronounce her in-laws' names, and it turns out that her mother-in-law's name sounded similar to the word for cucumber in our language. So every time the word cucumber came up, she had to switch to Bengali. That is so cool. So I'll share something about this later, but that process of replacing a word that sounds like somebody's name that you're not supposed to say is actually kind of a big factor in how languages can change, how their sound systems can change, how they develop new vocabulary. I could talk about that for a long time, but that system right there, where you switch words to avoid somebody's name, has big effects on a language. It's awesome. Let's see. Growing up, we never called our family members by their first name, but through their Yupik kinship name. Yeah, that's really cool. I think a lot of people do that. They use like cousin as a term of address or auntie rather than saying somebody's name. If that happens in your language, let us know. That's cool. Tara notes, hearing vocabulary lists recorded by linguists in the 90s was my first introduction to my language. Oh, wow. Yeah, that's kind of a cool story of the life that documentation materials can have after they're made, right? You never know. Maybe the recordings that you make today will be the first time a descendant in the future hears your language. That's a pretty powerful image. Krishna notes it's better if language documentation triggers language revitalization. Yeah, I mean, I would agree. That's not a universal truth, but personally, I do hope that documentation is used and contributes to language revitalization. Let's see, Gulbahar notes, is there something like UN language safe to documentations? Actually, I might ask for clarification on that one. Do you mean that there are languages which are safe, right? They're not endangered and that are documented? Or do you mean like, is there a language safe, like an archive, like a safe keeping place for documentation? Gulbahar, if you want to elaborate, let me know. Let's see. Malia Nora says, this is really interesting. Greeting from the Philippines. Thank you. Greetings to you in the Philippines. Tarab, if you can't write in the Q&A bar, feel free to just drop it in the chat. Oh, Ezra, it's 5 a.m. your time zone. Wow, thanks for staying up late with us. This is great. Greetings, Mirzona in Bangladesh. Hello. Wasim, thank you. Thank you to you for being here. Let's see, Spandan, oh, great. I will add some readings for discourse analysis. It's a really interesting field of study. Let's see. So Charles asks, there are many dialects in some major but endangered languages. Which dialect do we need or should prefer to document? Great question. I can't really tell you which one to work on. It depends on your own goals and your own relationships in those communities. So when you're trying to think of which dialects or language varieties to work on, one thing to consider might be which ones are more endangered, which ones have that urgency, right? If there are some where there are maybe only a few elders who know the language today, that might tell you that that's a really urgent situation to start working on. Similarly, if you yourself have personal ties to one of those dialects or varieties, right? If your family speaks it, if you have a friend who speaks it, if you really love that village where it's spoken, maybe work on that one. Or if you have special interests about language, like if you're really interested in, I don't know, certain tone systems, and one of those dialects has a really interesting tone system, you can work on that one just for your own personal interest. It's really up to you. There's no right answer about which dialect or even language to document. Hi, Beulah. It's 4 a.m. in the UK. My goodness, thank you also for staying up with us. What email can we contact you at? I will drop my email in the chat. It's pretty easy to remember. It is just anna@endangeredlanguages.com. So we also have, oh, thank you, Maria, for dropping the Facebook group in the chat. I appreciate that. Katie asks, will we be discussing ways to protect our documentation? My elders are always afraid of someone profiting financially from their work. That is a really important question. Thank you, Katie. Yeah, there are a lot of not so ethical practices that have happened in language documentation where, for example, someone records with elders, tells them it's for the benefit of the community, and then let's say they publish a book and start selling it and copyright the materials in that book. There was a pretty high profile case of that recently. Obviously, you don't want that to happen. You don't want people to copyright your language or lie to elders about where the documentation will go. So when we're talking about protecting the recordings you make, ensuring that they are only used for the purposes you want them used for, there are some different ways to go about it. One option is most language archives have what they call access protocols or access settings. You get to decide who you want to be able to see or hear those recordings, right? So you can say only people who live in this town should be able to see it, only people in this community should be able to see it, only people who are enrolled in this nation should be able to see it. You can also be more specific. You can say, I made this recording for the following 300 people. Only these 300 people should be able to see it. Other options do include if you are part of a formally incorporated tribe or nation, you could look into whether you can copyright those recordings as the tribe or nation. I am not an intellectual property lawyer, so I can't tell you exactly how it works. But we can also talk more about ethical and copyright issues in language documentation in future sessions for sure. Gulbahar, oh, specifies. So you're talking about some way to help languages for safekeeping. So is there something like a UN support for this or an NGO support for this? There is no UN-backed language archive. The UN has a few programs that are mostly around sort of ensuring awareness at the international level and also encouraging nation states to respect language rights and support documentation and revitalization. If you are interested in these sort of large international structures that support language documentation and revitalization, One of them, I guess, is ELP. We try to provide trainings and learning resources in this field. There are also a lot of universities that work at the international level that host language archives. For example, the University of Hawaii has the Kaipuleohone Archive, which hosts language recordings from all parts of the world. So there are a lot of different options for getting support and training and funding and archival space. And we'll talk a little bit more about that on week 7 or 8. I can't remember exactly which week, but we'll talk more about options for funding and supporting this work. Ronnie says, I'm interested in comparative phonetic and cosmological analysis in stories. That sounds super interesting. Hopefully we'll get to hear a little bit about what you're doing in that field. Carmen asks, how does someone recording a language know where a line is drawn between dialects of the one language as a whole? Or is the idea to document all and sort them out if possible, leaving variations to blend in a little if there's not that much information on it? That is a great and very insightful and very complicated question, Carmen. So first of all, the way we draw lines between languages and dialects is a little artificial, actually very artificial, a little ambiguous. There is one thing that's sort of the default method used by linguists, and that is called mutual intelligibility. So that basically means if two people are talking and they can basically understand each other, that means they are probably speaking varieties or dialects of the same language. Now, then you might ask, well, what if they can understand part of it or most of it, but not all of it? And then we get into the complicated question of quantifying that mutual intelligibility, right? So some organizations or researchers put that line at 80%. So if you can understand 80% of what the other person is saying, you're speaking dialects of the same language, right? But again, that is a very arbitrary, artificial line. Another way of looking at it would be, how do people in the community see it, or in the various communities that use that language? Their lines that they draw might be different than linguistic lines, and that's also super valid. If people tell you, here in this village, we speak this dialect, and over there in that village, they speak a different one, that's probably a pretty meaningful way to draw that line, right? Those are the people who use the language and know the language best. You should probably listen to them and factor that into your analysis. So when you're doing documentation, I always really encourage people to start off with not necessarily surveys, but a lot of conversations in a language that you share between yourself and the people you're working with. Start just by talking about the language. How many people use it? How do people feel about it? What do other people find important to record? And in those conversations, you can call them interviews, you can call them sociolinguistic surveys. Talk also about different varieties of the language, right? Ask, do people speak differently in different villages? Do people speak differently based on their clan or their family? Ask the people around you and use that in your analysis, in your documentation. Yeah, there's a lot more to it, but it's pretty complicated and there's no one single correct answer. So if you'd like to talk more about your own context and how to unpack that, I'm happy to. Feel free to send an email or post in the Facebook group. So Janine says, speaking of documenting, when recording translations from English to an Indigenous language, is there a system of how you record the translations? So for example, when reading the word and the definition, are there steps to follow? Yeah, good question. Linguists have some kind of standard templates that we use for this. So for example, when we're just getting started working with a language, we like to use this thing called the Swadesh list. If you remember in like the very first slide, we used a quote from the linguist Morris Swadesh. He developed this list of a couple of hundred terms that are pretty universal, stuff that every human being talks about, like hand and fire and feather, things like that. And so we tend to start by getting those words and those definitions and matching them up. And then when we start to do more complicated translations, um, there are a few different methods. We can talk about some of those specific methods. One that's really easy for beginners is called basic oral language documentation. Happy to post some materials about that. Let me just make a note, post bold. But the basic idea there is that you record someone talking naturally, right? Maybe they're singing a song or telling a story or sharing about their childhood. Record them just speaking in the language. And then after you've recorded that, go back to them with that recording and play a little bit of it and ask them to translate just that little bit in English or whatever language you share together, and do that for the whole recording and record them translating the previous recording, right? That way you don't have to have a writing system developed. You don't have to really write anything down. You just get the translation recorded while also letting them speak naturally the first time around without having to stop and translate every 30 seconds. That's one good starting point for translation work. We can talk about others. Yeah, feel free to email me or reach out. Let's see, Leonora asks, may I know again what will transpire in the webinar on October 1st? Yes, I'm so happy to tell you about that again. Let's go all the way back to that slide. Somewhere over here, it's coming. There we go. So the language documentation training fellows are 3 folks who have been working with ELP over the summer to develop these basic skills in language documentation, just like all of you are doing right now. And so tomorrow we will be hearing from them and seeing some of the video recordings and translations that they have created in their language documentation work. And they will also be available to answer any questions you might have about what it means or what it's like to really do language documentation in real life. So this is a great opportunity to see other people who have recently begun language documentation work and gone out and accomplished really cool things in a short amount of time with just cell phones in their communities. So this is a great opportunity to come learn about it. And I will drop the link in the chat again. Let me know if I'm getting this link right, because I'm just typing it right off the top of my head. If somebody can tell me if this link works, it should be a Zoom meeting registration. Let me know. Let's see. Asim notes, UNT has one archive, Coursal for South Asian languages. Yeah, there are a lot of archives at universities. Some of them focus on a specific area of the world. Some of them cover all of the languages in the whole world. Great, thank you. I'm glad that link works. Beautiful. Yeah, so there's the one at UNT. There's the one called ELAR, the Endangered Languages Archive. Many, many more, the Archive of Languages and Oral Resources of Africa. So wherever you are, wherever your language is, there is probably an archive that would be very happy to host your materials. Francel notes, Indigenous people have the right to protect their intellectual property, including the right to protect that property against inappropriate use or exploitation. Similarly, Indigenous peoples are seeking to protect their traditional knowledge and practices from commercial exploitation. Yes, absolutely. And this extends beyond language, right? This also includes things like medical knowledge, scientific knowledge, technologies, music, all of it. And there is a real problem with outsiders taking, extracting that knowledge, that data, that technology, and then profiting from it. And so data sovereignty and intellectual property protection are really important fields of action. And if any of you have experiences or things that have worked well in your community for protecting your shared knowledge and traditional science, please share about it. That could be really useful to other folks here. All right, question. I'm curious if the definition of Indigenous languages is inclusive of languages of non-Indigenous people. That is such a very good question, and it actually requires us to unpack what Indigenous actually means. There is no clear answer to that. And actually, there is a nice blog post that sort of untangles the political and non-linguistic meanings of the term indigenous as it applies to languages. I'm going to drop that here in the chat. It's called Welcome to the Year of Unindigenous Languages, and it covers a little bit about places in the world where you cannot safely self-identify as indigenous, or communities that choose not to use the label indigenous, or where it really just doesn't apply. So the definition of indigenous languages actually doesn't include languages of non-indigenous people, right? Because what is an indigenous language? Well, it's a language used by indigenous people. But language documentation doesn't only cover indigenous languages. It really covers all potential use of languages, including what we call minoritized languages. So these are languages that have been minoritized where they are spoken, but maybe don't quite fit the definition of indigenous. And then there are also languages which are endangered, but not indigenous. So Creole languages, for example, probably don't fit the definition of indigenous very well, but are often endangered. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. It's a very complicated answer. Let's see. Francel asks, should language vitality assessment be conducted first before language documentation? Yeah, good question. I would say it is not a necessity, but it's always a good thing to have when you're doing a documentation project. It's always useful to kind of know where you are at the moment in order to decide where you want to go. And that applies to documentation as well as revitalization. So conducting a vitality assessment actually takes quite a lot of time and effort and work and sometimes resources. So if you really feel it's urgent to get started, for example, if there are just a few elders who know the language, you may not need a vitality assessment. You already know that there are just a few elders, and really the priority is to start working with them and recording language. If, however, you're really interested in developing a language revitalization plan or doing a big, large-scale systematic documentation project, it can be really, really useful to have a sense of vitality and the current sort of user base of the language and how people want to proceed. So it's not a necessity. You don't have to do it first, but it can be really, really useful. I hope that answers your question. It's kind of a non-answer. All right, let's see. I think that's it for questions. Let me check Facebook because I have been neglecting the Facebook feed. Let's see. And if anybody else has other questions or thoughts, please just type them in now. Oh, I see Jonathan here on the Facebook stream. Says congratulations. Thanks, Jonathan. Appreciate it. And what else? Yeah, you should. Yeah, minoritized language is a very useful term because it can apply in those settings where indigenous doesn't quite fit or can't safely be used for whatever reason. Yeah, pretty inclusive of a lot of different languages in different places. Let's see, Avishta, I see your hand up. Yeah, if anybody has other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or the Q&A or both, either one. Oh, thank you, Aida. It's nice to hear that you think it's cool. Violet, yes. Anything that you missed, we have recorded this whole session and we will post the recording so you can go back and watch it later. All right, I'll hang out for a couple more minutes in case other people have questions, but oh, okay, that was a mistake. Awesome. Yeah, and thank you all again for being here. I'm so excited to learn with all of you for the next 9 weeks. So next week, we'll be learning about audio and video recording, some best practices for making good quality recordings, even if you don't have fancy equipment, right? Even if you just have a cell phone you can still make pretty good language documentation materials. So we'll talk about some of the ways to make your audio and video clear and useful. Great. All right. Well, thanks everybody. I will post this recording in the Facebook group and on the YouTube. I will also put these slides on the Facebook group, and I will try and remember all of the reading materials y'all asked for. I think it was discourse analysis and basic oral language documentation methods. If there's anything else that you would like me to post, let me know. I will find a copy and put it in there. And I hope all of you have a really wonderful night or morning or afternoon or whatever it is where you are. Oh, Spandan, the readings will be posted in the Facebook group. If you don't have Facebook, email me and I will start a Google Drive folder. All right, and if you have any questions in the meantime, put them in the Facebook group or send an email. We'll find somebody who can answer. Thanks, everybody. Take care, be well, have a good day or night. Bye, everyone.